Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome or welcome back, as the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm your host to these tectonic conversations, and today I'm joined by the one and only David Shapiro. David, thank you very much for your time, and welcome to this part two.
Thanks for having me back.
It's a pleasure. So, for those of you following us live, this is a live session on this fine August 22nd, 2025. And you would be reminded that this is now going to be a part two in our 6-part live series of these webcast conversations intended to unpack the framework that David Shapiro has been working on and building for the last couple of years on the topic of post-labor economics. And this series, this 6-part series, directly map to the manuscript and of the book that David has written called The Great Decoupling, which we hope will be published very soon. What we're going to do today, David, is we're going to start with a brief recap on basic concepts of post-labor economics and why they are really important and timely to discuss now. Then I'm going to ask you, David, to walk us through the 8 sort of chapters or subsections of this part 2 of your manuscript. The part 2, by the way, is called The Decline of Labor, and hence this episode is going to be called The Decline of Labor. But here is briefly what we're going to discuss today. We're going to start with the history of labor substitution and talk about this historical trend that has been unfolding. We'll talk about the structural decline of labor, especially in the advanced economies, as sort of subsection 2. Then we're going to talk about the historical importance of labor power. Why is labor essential for a healthy economy to function properly? After that, we're going to touch on the automation imperative, also known as the labor substitution fallacy. Many people are suggesting, rightly so, that new technology always created new jobs. And I said rightly so because this could actually be the fallacy, that technology is not necessarily always creating new jobs. We'll unpack that. Then we're going to talk about the 4th paradigm of the human's economic paradigms and the fact that we are now in the midst of the 4th paradigm that is slightly addressing the issue of potential new jobs. We'll then delve into the economic agency paradox. We'll talk about the Zero-Labor Optimum, which is an interesting contemplation of how corporations behave out there in the wild. And then we'll wrap it up with the future of labor. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about what might be those jobs that remain, some of which would be, of course, available to people as they think and make their moves as they navigate through this transition, the transformation that we are in. So enough of that brief, that was not a brief intro. And then after we go through these eight subsections, then we'll talk about questions that we have received from our audiences. And I will also invite those who are watching us live, if you do have any questions, please use Q&A function to submit them. So David, let's start at the very, very top. And can you please share with us what is post-labor economics and why should we care about it now?
Yeah, so the very dry academic definition of post-labor economics, it is a decoupling of economic productivity from human inputs. In simpler terms, when machines become better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, it is basically economically inevitable that humans are replaced, that labor substitution eventually occurs. Another way of thinking about this is that humans have 4 primary offerings that we can give to the economy in exchange for money. That is strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy. Well, we've already automated away strength. We're working on automating away dexterity and cognition right now with AI and humanoid robots, meaning that empathy is the last thing that we have to offer the economy. But AI is also really good at empathy. It's in fact better than
Yeah.
some humans that you may know at empathy. So the question then remains, what can humans even offer the economy if machines surpass us as better, faster, cheaper, and safer across all four of the primary food groups of activities we can give people? So that is the high level overview. That's more the impetus behind post-labor economics. Post-labor economics then explores why this is happening, what does it mean, and then eventually what do we do about it? So that's where we're focusing on today's episode, which is just the structural permanent decline of labor over it's been accelerating over the last couple decades, but it's been here for several centuries.
Yeah. And the basic theory is that this process has been ongoing pretty much forever, that mechanizations, technology, and automation replaces human work, but that we are now in a particular unique situation because AI and intelligent robotics are actually now starting to displace those most human traits of humans, which is cognition, which is empathy, which is fine dexterity of our hands, right?
Yep.
And that what you're postulating here is that this process is inevitable, but because of the tremendous exponential growth in AI and automation, the process is superbly accelerated. So things that may have taken a century previously now could be taking only years. And
Correct.
so, and I think that you came up with a really powerful term to describe, I think many people will intuitively realize that as this automation proceeds and more people find themselves without work, um, we are dealing with now with, a large number of potential labor refugees, as you call them. And for our societies to continue to function, to continue to keep the societies at peace and prosperity, we need to figure out what do we do with those who are impacted through this transition, this cohort of labor refugees. Because what I think both you and I believe is that the end of this transition, if we do this right, we could actually create a fantastically successful, prosperous human society that can enjoy abundance of goods and services available to everyone. So I think that we both are, I think, optimists. You are maybe more realist. I'm more of an optimist. But what we are saying is that we have an opportunity as humanity to create something really beautiful and unique for us. We are facing transition, though. And this transition we need to address seriously. This is the key, I think, message of post-labor economics. So thank you very much for that, David. Let's maybe start unpacking the decline of labor. Tell us a little bit about your research into the history of labor substitution.
Yeah, so the probably the best place to start is by just defining what is automation. Automation, from an economic perspective, is labor-saving technology. It allows you to do more with less human input. Everything from the wheel to the water wheel to even animal husbandry and domesticating animals. That was kind of the beginning of labor substitution. So instead of plowing a field by hand, you yoke an ox or a horse or a donkey and
Yep.
you let them take some of the load off. And of course, you don't really have to pay a beast of burden. You just pay them in oats or hay and water, and you take care of them and protect them from wolves. And then you essentially have free labor. That's where it started. For me, where a lot of my research kind of really picked up is I define the modern era as the invention of the Gutenberg printing press forward. So we've had about 500 years of labor-saving technology. Now, the reason that I start there is because arguably the printing press was the first really truly exponential technology. Originally, it took about 1 to 2 to 3 years to by hand to make a copy of a book. However, with the advent of the Gutenberg printing press, and I'm specifying Gutenberg printing press because the Chinese had a printing press for I think 300 or 400 years before the West did, but they managed to not have an intellectual renaissance for very complex reasons that we don't need to get into. But the Gutenberg printing press specifically accelerated the rate of book production by a factor of 100 to 200x or possibly more,
Yeah.
because it did take a year or so to set up the die, because you had to print every page. But once you had all the dies set up, you could just churn out books, and it would take only a couple weeks to do a printing run of several hundred or several thousand copies of any given book. So that's kind of where it started. Then you fast forward, so that's what we call the Renaissance today. Not specifically that the printing press kicked off the Renaissance, but it was part of the European, what started in Southern European Renaissance.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, which unfolded over several centuries, starting in the mid 18th century with steam power, mechanization, fast forward to electricity, fast forward to internet, so on and so forth. We basically, as a society, systematized what is now called creative destruction, which is we use technologies to unlock untold new potential, but at the expense of existing, not just existing jobs, but existing ways of life. That's one of the primary things that we need to emphasize is that we have seen this happen for several centuries now, where entire ways of life have been invalidated by new technologies. At the beginning of the 19th century in America, 70 to 90% of Americans were farmers. At the beginning of the 20th century, only 40% were farmers. And at the beginning of the 21st century, only 2% were farmers. So an entire way of life is all but gone because of this process of creative destruction. And that is the most durable trend that we have seen. Now, as you foretold, people have come to believe that, okay, yes, there is the creation component. You know, we could there was the job of YouTuber did not exist in the 20th century.
Yeah.
That's a 21st century job. So the idea is that yes, technology enables new kinds of tasks and new markets at the expense of destroying older ones. However, and this is what we'll unpack for the rest of this video, is what we're not seeing so far is the creation of the new
Yeah.
tasks, new jobs yet. Some are being created. However, the rate of creation it pales in comparison to the rate of destruction. So we're not keeping up. And that is concerning because if this holds for any length of time, we're going to need to come up with an entirely new paradigm rather than the wage labor social contract than we have today. And that is the core thesis of the decline of labor.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So now you also reflected on the structural decline of labor that has been occurring perhaps with increased intensity throughout the 20th century and propelling in the second half of the 20th century. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And you also introduced the concept of the secular trend, the term of a secular trend. So let's talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is it's a term that is talked about a little bit less in business and finance, which is the secular trend versus a business cycle. So and the reason that I'm bringing this up and bringing it into the conversation is because one of the things that one of kind of the category errors that I see people making is they're assuming that artificial intelligence is part of a business cycle. They look at, is AI in a bubble? Is there a hype cycle? And they assume that this is just a short-term trend and then it will go back into an AI winter or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But by all definitions or all perspectives, artificial intelligence and more broadly automation and robotics is part of a secular trend, which means that it structurally changes the game and it's irreversible. Those are two of the main criteria. There's several more. Just in the same way that electricity fundamentally reshaped the economic game, whether you're in business, whether you're in politics and finance, doesn't matter. Electricity changed the rules. Diesel engines changed the rules again. And then internet, again, changed the rules as to what was required to do business and to engage successfully in commerce. Likewise, artificial intelligence, we're still relatively early with the wave of generative AI, and we haven't even really seen the mass adoption of humanoid robots yet because they haven't quite hit product market fit. They're getting close. But when they do, humanoid robots are about to have their own chat GPT moment in the next year or two. And that might be a gross overestimate. We're often proven wrong when we try and forecast how long it will take for these moments to happen. They often happen in months rather than years.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're looking at a seismic shift in the way, or a sea change in the way that business is being conducted due to this next wave of automation technologies.
And the reason why you believe this is true, I do too, is because just like electricity that you mentioned previously, just like internal combustion engine, just like the wheel, AI is general technology. It is
Yes.
applicable to everything, everywhere, and therefore it is clearly going to be immersed and embedded in everything we do. This is not in other words, this ain't a fad. And what we do know, though, is that it is true that there were AI winters. There were multiple AI winters that happened in the last 40 years, 50 years of AI research. I think that we have now broken through the final AI winter, and we are going to be in the eternal AI spring and summer, I think.
Yes.
Uh, so let's just speak a little bit now into the structural decline of labor. You're talking about two specific things that are driving the structural decline in the second half of the 20th century, technology and policy. I'd love if you could sort of unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, so starting in the 1950s, 1953 is kind of the high water mark for employment in America. Ever since then, we've been very slowly and steadily declining in terms of prime age population, male population being part of the labor force. So from 1953 to 1979, that was still kind of the golden era.
Yeah.
And I put 1979 as the end of the golden era because that's when manufacturing in America peaked. It was about 21 or 22 million jobs, American jobs were in manufacturing, and today it's about 12 million. But
Wow.
in that 4.5 decades, manufacturing productivity in terms of total output has tripled, even though the headcount has almost been cut in half.
That's
Now, some of
sixfold. Yeah, that's a
yeah,
sixfold increase, right?
yep, sixfold increase in domestic productivity. Now, some people might say, well, some of that is offshoring. This is excluding the offshoring. This is what David Autor calls the missing million. So when you look at the actual output of American manufacturing, it should, quote unquote, should employ millions more than it does, but it doesn't because of automation.
Mm.
So that's a big component. We're also seeing the same thing happen with business process automation and back office workers. And nobody is really tracking it yet, not to the degree that we need to. But I'm trying to do it to look at the numbers. You look at changes in payrolls. You look at people that are marginally attached workers rising sharply with every wave of AI. So there are clues that the same thing is happening to once safe white collar work.
Yeah,
So that's the automation side. Now, the other component is the policy side.
that's right.
So neoliberalism is the current soup du jour of economic theory. It doesn't matter left or right. Most Republicans and most Democrats are some form of
Yeah,
neoliberalism.
yeah.
And of course, even the neoliberal purists will say we're not truly purely neoliberal. That's fine. It's of course always messy. However, everyone from America up to the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and the IMF all believe wholeheartedly in neoliberal market theory.
Mhm.
One of the primary things, and there's a lot to pick on with neoliberalism, but one of the primary things that this focuses on is prioritizing business interests above worker interests. So the idea of hollowing out unions, undermining unions. So union membership has declined from over, I think, 20 to 25% to about 8% today. So that reduces union power, that reduces labor power. It puts more power in the hands of corporations. And interestingly enough, I did a meta study, and one of the things that I found is that adoption of neoliberal policies is very strongly correlated, positively correlated with declining birth rates. And so it should be no surprise to anyone
Yeah,
that when you put corporations' interests above the interests of families, that something's got to give eventually. And so there's
yeah.
a form, this is what's called economic withdrawal. And so sometimes it's a form of active resistance, but in this case, it's a completely organic response to the fact that companies get bailouts and subsidies at a far higher rate than many families do. And so when that happens, and when we end up with the gigification of the economy, then labor has even less power. The reason that labor has less power is because automation effectively acts as more employees. So
That's
when
right.
labor is
Yeah.
scarce, this is one
Yeah.
of the things that we talk about. When labor is scarce, you have more bargaining power. However, with the abundance of labor that automation creates, that effectively means that you're competing against machines that can't say no. And that's only going to get worse as those machines get better. This is a process called capital intensification. Now, capital intensification is just an economic process that has nothing to do with neoliberalism, but capital intensification allows for the continual undermining of labor power. So all of these kind of orbit the same inevitable end result in the
Yeah.
long run.
So now you touched on the topic of labor power. There is a subsection on the importance of labor power. That's where we go next. And for the audience, I'd just love if you could describe these two opposites, this dichotomy that happens when societies have scarcity of labor, and what's the consequence of that, and what happens when societies have excess labor and labor glut, and what happens that. So, what does history teach us in those two sort of perspectives?
Yeah. So when you have labor scarcity, and there's any number of reasons that you might have labor scarcity. It could be due to war demands. So wartime demands took a lot of working age men, put them in as soldiers overseas. So then that actually in America in particular, not just in America, but that led very strongly to women's empowerment. So
Yeah,
women were got into the workforce, and then the men came home, and the
yeah,
government tried to say, "Okay, women, you go back home," and they were like, "No, we're not going to do that. You can't put this genie back in the bottle."
yeah.
So that's one example. Another example from all over Western Europe was the bubonic plague
Correct. Yeah,
dramatically reduced populations. And so then, as Europe was recovering, in some places up to 50% of people died from plague. In most places, it was about 20% to about a third of people died of plague. Then the landlords, the feudal lords or kingdoms or duchies, they realized that the workers that they relied upon they could seize production. They could say, we're
yeah,
not gonna work for you until you give us more rights, until you give us better pay. And this is actually one of the reasons that England has a very long history of strengthening democracy over many, many centuries.
yeah.
Fortunately, America was able to borrow all of those many centuries of lessons and package them all up in 1776. Uh, we have not gotten it perfect. If we could repeat this with all the last 2.5 centuries of lessons, we might shape democracy a little bit differently. But the point is that that created a new trajectory for Western Europe in particular. Now,
Yeah.
the contrary point is what happens if you have a labor glut for a long period of time. There's two primary places that I look. So Eastern Europe is one place, particularly the Soviet bloc, and then also historical China.
Yep.
So historical China, we can go way back. Historical China has been geographically, it's kind of insular. You've got dense jungles to the south and deserts and arid steppes to the north, and then a gigantic ocean to their east.
Yep.
So it's very hemmed in, and this is why China calls itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of the planet. Within the middle of that is a very, very fertile set of rivers.
Hmm.
And that meant that most people made their living from farming. And with that abundance of food, you also came with an abundance of people. And an abundance of people, basically what that ultimately meant is that the warlords of China or the emperors of China considered peasants more or less a perennial crop,
Yeah. Crop.
and
Exactly.
very dehumanized.
Yeah.
And so when human labor is cheap, human life is cheap. And then you might say, okay, well, that's just China. That's one example from, the Iron Age. But if you fast forward in particularly the 19th and 20th century in Russia, you see the same thing again, where people are basically considered expendable. And you see that even through to today with the way that Putin is treating Russian men on the front line in his war of aggression on Ukraine. And so when you have excess population. Of course, I don't really like using that term, but that's the perspective of people in control of those kinds of lands. When you have excess population, life becomes cheap. Democracy becomes optional. Uh, and that is one of the things that I think a lot of people who are paying attention to this trend are afraid of because we lose labor
Yep.
power. we become irrelevant to the state and businesses, does our even our life become devalued? And
Yeah.
historically, the answer is yeah, that's a distinct possibility.
Yeah. And what is really important to sort of take away from this brief conversation is that it was actually labor scarcity um, that translated into societies that had ultimately most success, right? It was
Yes.
labor scarcity, and that led to successful Western democracies and the emergence of United States and West as the most dominant, powerful empires over the last 300-400 years.
Absolutely.
So now, so therefore, we've established the criticality of labor power and the dangers when labor loses its power. And what we are now saying is that we are in the middle of uh, labor substitution. Now, many would say, don't worry. Um, there is always new technology. There will be always new industries emerging. That's been our experience. That's the creative part of the creative destruction, right?
Yep.
So don't worry. Yes, this is tough. This is another sort of creative destruction moment, just fueled by AI and automation. You say that's not true, right? That's this time it could be different, or it is different.
Yes. So
Why?
far, the data is already kind of unequivocal. It's what I call the labor substitution fallacy. And there is an older term called the Luddite fallacy. So the Luddite fallacy is kind of what I'm saying. It's the inverse of that. So the Luddite fallacy says that once automation comes, your jobs are gone for good and nobody's going to have any work. So that was the original fallacy. The new version is the inverse, which says actually maybe this time that might happen. And the data bears this out when we say, okay, look at what technology is creating, look at the jobs that it's eroding, the hollowing out of the middle class, jobs polarization, that sort of thing. We're already seeing, and we have been seeing for the last few decades, productivity goes up. That's exactly what you expect with automation. That's why we do it with less human input. But the surplus from that creation, that new wealth being generated, is not necessarily creating new jobs. And the reason that it allows wealth to accumulate is because companies don't hire out of the goodness of their hearts. They hire because they need to. And so that is what I call the labor substitution fallacy, which is, yes, labor, something might get substituted here, but it's going to create a new job somewhere else. That's not necessarily true. What technology is, what it actually does, is it's deflationary. So what
Yeah.
deflationary means is that it lowers the cost of goods and services, which then liberates capital to be spent on new demands. But there's no economic law or no economic doctrine that says any new demands must be satisfied by human input. Doesn't exist anywhere. So
Yeah.
if you can render goods and services without human input, you don't. And many companies are doing that. Look
Yeah.
at Instagram, look at OnlyFans, look at all the tech companies with an RPE, that's revenue per employee, above $1 million. You couldn't do that with Coca-Cola or GM or Ford because the margins just didn't exist. However, with technology, particularly internet-based technologies or digital based companies, you can be a $1 trillion company with only a couple hundred employees.
So really, what the key takeaway here is that it is not true that new technology automatically creates jobs. New technology actually frees up capital that can be redeployed to create new demand, and it is that new demand that creates new jobs. But if we agree that humans bring strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy, and that right now, cognition, empathy, and ultimately dexterity through robotics will be delivered via AI and robotics. There is no reason why any potential new jobs, new industries would require humans in the first place, right? That's
Right.
the biggest takeaway here. Now, another important thing that you introduced here is the concept of automation imperative with organizations.
Yes.
It sounds intuitive, but let's Please describe it.
Yeah, so the primary idea here is that as automation becomes available, whether or not you choose to do it, your competitors might, meaning if you want to stay in business, you need to engage in automation. Now, there's going to be an optimum level of automation based on what the market can offer. Many companies would gladly, get rid of more of their employees, but the automation is just not there yet. It's not good enough. But as the frontier of automation advances, so the frontier of automation is the total sphere of
Yep.
every task and job and business activity that can be automated, as that sphere expands, well, that encroaches upon what humans can offer because right now humans offer some labor arbitrage between what we can do and what machines cannot do yet. However, if the sphere of human capability is subsumed by that growing sphere of automation, eventually you don't hire humans anymore.
Yep.
Now, this is, that's a potential end state. So people might say, "Ah, well, how long will it take to get there?" and that sort of thing. It's not necessarily a question of if or when we will get there, because we don't need to get to 100% unemployment before this becomes a crisis.
Yeah.
If we get to 11% unemployment in America or other developed economies, that's a crisis. That's a
Yep.
durable crisis. If
Yep.
it gets to 15% unemployment or 20% unemployment, that's a disaster.
Yep.
So all
That's
that you
right.
need to understand is that companies have based on market pressures, based on fiduciary duty to shareholders and the
Yeah.
board, they're going to be automating, and you don't have no extra encouragement is required. They're always looking for ways to cut corners, and automation is one of the best ways to lower expenses. So as the automation gets better, faster, cheaper, and safer, they're going to be automating more and more, and that puts even more pressure, even more downward pressure on labor.
Yeah. So, yeah, and therefore the process is like this scenario is essentially embedded in the market economy system that we have. This is a natural logical outcome, and while every organization individually needs to do this for its competitiveness and survival, and every organization and their leaders are incentivized to actually to make sure this truly happens locally, these locally sound decisions, when expanded across the whole economy, could lead us into that scenario. I 100% agree with you that we don't need to have full unemployment at all, right? What people might not know, for example, is that the height of the Great Depression of 1930s in 1933, I think that the peak unemployment reached 25%. And that also means that 75% of people did have jobs. And it was the lowest sort of trough of the Great Depression. So we don't this as you said, so this needs to just go into double digits and the situation can really spiral. This is why I think we need to be looking at this urgently, and why I believe your work is very, very important, because unlike other futurists who are good in painting what might come, you have done that, but also providing actual interventions, measurements, and solutions that people need to be considering, both policymakers, individuals, and corporations. Now, if you don't mind, maybe we'll stop. I just want to I have a very great question, because what we've been discussing so far is pretty sort of gloomy. I have a question from Adam, and it's a great question. He says, we all know how powerful fear is. And this is like people are fearful of what's going to come. But research shows that one emotion is actually more powerful and viral than fear. It's awe. What do both of you find the most awe-inspiring in this great decoupling? And how might we start fire-hosing the conversation with more tangible artifacts of awe? In other words, what's good that could come out of this? Can we maybe spend a minute on that, and then we can revert to the remainder of the chapter?
Yeah. So I have, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned like I tend to be a little bit more pragmatic. I'm actually a diehard optimist. I've had to temper everything that I say with very, very pragmatic, rigorous, realistic kind of nitty-gritty nuts and bolts. However, once you wrap your head around what's coming, because yes, the default reaction to seismic change is fear. That is because we have little rabbit-hearted chimpanzee hearts and brains, and big change was very, very scary and often catastrophic for our ancestors, and can still be catastrophic. So it provokes an existential dread. Uh, and one reason that I personally, and I'm putting all the disclaimers first, and then I'll address the substance of the question. One reason that I avoid more hyperbolic utopian stuff is because it's very easy for people to dismiss that. You can't market on that. You can't, well, you can market on it, but then it's just marketing. And when you look at the Silicon Valley types like Sam Altman and others saying like we're going to produce this and it's going to be so great, it's the best thing in the world, a lot of people on the outside say these people look like they're having a religious experience about their technology that they're creating.
Yep.
So that's why I advise against doubling down on trying to sell awe. What I would emphasize is just taking a moment to look at what we have been able to achieve so far, what actually has been produced. There's been keynotes entitled stuff like "We made sand think," right? Because sand is silicon dioxide. You take the silicon out of that, and then you make silicon chips, and now it thinks, and it thinks better than many of us do. That is in and of itself pretty remarkable. There's memes going around where there's a caveman looking at a rock saying, "How do I make this think abstractly?" Right? And that's what we've managed to do. We've managed to literally make the stuff that we pull out of rocks think better than us, and it can think abstractly and those sorts of things. That is in itself awe-inspiring. So my recommendation is just focus on the nuts and bolts, the reality, but then frame it in a way that's like, yeah, that is actually pretty special. That's pretty unique. Look at how much time we've saved on developing new drugs. Look at how much time we've saved on writing more code. And of course, many people say, yeah, who cares, right? That's just tech bro stuff. But that is where it is. And I tend to prefer to let something speak for itself. I'm a power of ideas kind of person.
So thank you for that, David. If I might add sort of a couple of my perspectives of what is awe-inspiring to me, I believe that there is sufficient wealth that exists on Earth that truly can result in every one of 8 billion people living with decency of life, that they can be provided with basic needs, basic services, basic goods, and therefore that we can truly create a society of plenty, that there is enough resources on Earth, and that this technology is going to actually make those resources converted into goods and services that will be affordable for everyone. This will be liberating for humanity. Yes, it is scary, the transition is scary, but I think the ultimate end state, if we pull this right, will be true state of abundance. And the people who live in that state will look back at our times as the general sort of age of enslavement of humanity that lasted for 12,000 years. And that we will rediscover what truly liberation means. And people who are now complaining, oh my God, what am I going to do about my job? My job defines who I am, would look 20 years back and say, this was just silly, that we decided that we were forced to be spending most of our waking hours doing this work that now automation does seamlessly and cheaply. The second transformational thing I think is around medicine, and the fact that I believe that we are actually equally on the irreversible journey towards what Ray Kurzweil calls the longevity escape velocity, where in the next decade or so, I think technology is going to allow us to, at least in silico, solve all of illnesses and ailments of humanity, and that we might actually end up in a situation where extension of human life truly is real. So to me, these two are awe-inspiring, and these two are worth the effort, and these two are worth the discomfort of the transition that we find ourselves in. And David, my perspective would be, let's focus to get this transition behind us as quickly as possible. Let's not try to extend the pain. Let's try to narrow and shorten the pain of transition so that we can move into this age of abundance. And what is the danger? Why I'm spending my time and energy, and why are we organizing these conversations, is because there is an alternative scenario that takes us into a complete disaster. So I think that we are now collectively as humans at the point where we have to make a choice. Or are we going to create a Star Trek version of the future for us? Or are we going to create a Star Wars, Elysium type future for us? That, I think, is very raises the urgency and seriousness of this conversation. So thank you, David, for your thoughts. Shall we go back into the part two? By the way, thank you, Adam, for the great question. So we have established that labor is being displaced at scale, at speed, and that there is no fifth paradigm. We have a fourth paradigm emerging out of humans' economic, paradigms. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So over the last 2 centuries, we've gone through 3 full paradigm shifts. So for the majority of human civilization, we've been in an agrarian culture, or an agricultural economic paradigm, where farming was the primary economic activity and land was the most valuable asset. The next paradigm shift came with the industrial revolutions, where manufacturing became the primary engine of productivity. And then factories became the most valuable capital asset. Land was still valuable, but factories became even more valuable. That's when you see the robber barons with the steel barons, the oil tycoons, and the rail tycoons. That is when you can basically, you just look, who is the wealthiest person or the wealthiest set of businesses in any given epoch, and you can tell that's what economic paradigm you're in.
Yeah, exactly.
Fast forward, now what the wealthiest companies in the world are all big tech. So we're very well and fully into the service-based economy, which is predicated on knowledge work. That's why code is the most valuable activity that you can do. If you do it well and you do it for the right company, plenty of people write code that doesn't go anywhere, but that's beside the point. So that's the 3 paradigms. So agricultural, manufacturing, services.
Yeah.
Now there is a 4th paradigm. In the 90s, I can't recall the name of the economist that coined this term, but they called it the experience economy. And so they anticipated what we then called the attention economy. So the attention economy is social media. You're basically competing for human eyeballs, whether it is on Facebook or Netflix or whatever else. There's a 3rd term that I use that I feel like is upstream from both of those, which is the meaning economy. So the 4th paradigm is you're economizing around what is it that people want to spend their time doing. What is valuable to them, whether it's playing video games or spending time with friends or whatever, but you're trying to...
Meaning as in, where do people find meaning for themselves in that sense, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's not to say that meaning is itself a scarce resource, although you could argue that it is. But as goods and services are deflating, they're becoming cheaper. So then people have the one resource that they do have to economize, because it's limited for everyone, is time. So that's what the attention economy, the meaning economy, and the experience economy all orbit around, which is you have a finite amount of waking hours every day that you can use to engage with something, whether it's a transaction or value creation or whatever. So that's the 4th paradigm. Now, there's two directions to go from here. One is there's no 5th paradigm. There's no other place for labor refugees to go. It has not manifested yet if there is a 5th paradigm. And the 4th paradigm, the meaning economy, is not absorbing all the labor refugees already being displaced by automation.
Yeah. And that's
two big things.
Exactly. Now, this leads us into the next discussion around economic agency and economic agency paradox. So now what we are establishing is that automation is displacing work and human labor. It's inevitable. economic system drives this. What about the concept of economic agency and the economic agency paradox? Could you explain that for us, please?
Yes. So economic agency, quite simply, is how much control do you have over your economic destiny or fate? Labor rights, property rights, democratic rights, those are kind of three pillars of economic agency today and the social contract. You have the ability to vote. If you don't like the way the economy is going, you can vote for local, state, and federal politicians. So
Yep.
that gives everyone some collective influence over the direction of the economy. You have property rights, you have labor rights, so you have a right to work, you have a right to quit, you have, particularly in Western nations, you have very strong property rights.
Yep.
So you can own a piece of land and you don't have to defend it with your own guns,
Yep.
as an example. So that's what economic agency is how much agency does the state guarantee you to change your fortune. Now, the economic agency paradox is that capitalism, the direction that it's going, which is creating more automation, more abundance, and more wealth, it's deflating the cost of goods and services, which means your economic agency should be going up. But as we've seen over the last 2 decades, economic agency is generally going down, uh, more so for young people. Now, there's demographic reasons and there's debt reasons for that, but there's a larger underpinning structural component that is pushing economic agency down for everyone. And it's not just inflation, it's much more complex than that. Now, the paradox comes in is that as you would expect agency to go up, it's going down. So that's the paradox. And so then from a systems perspective or from a macroeconomic perspective, you say, okay, well, we want to have a slightly inflationary economy, and that's based on consumption and consumer demand.
Yep.
But if your consumers don't have a job because they've been laid off and automated away, that entire theory of how the economy should work starts to break down. That's the full kind of economic agency paradox
Yeah.
that we end up in a deflationary death spiral where you can't buy the goods and services that are cheaper because you don't have any jobs. And then if
Yeah.
there's no jobs, then there's no
Yeah.
consumption, and then everything kind of
Yeah.
crashes from.
So that spiral essentially looks, as you describe it, it looks like this. So the automation and AI and robotics reduces the costs of and goods and services that are being produced. However, those reductions of costs are due to the fact that there is less people working to produce them, and therefore less income to buy those goods and services. So while the cost of them is coming down, the ability to buy is coming down further, and that really is that vicious cycle that you call the deflationary spiral. Now, this implies that every organization's impetus is to drive to its lowest possible number of humans in the mix. This is what the current economic competitive system demands, essentially, of corporations and their executives, right? So
Yep.
you introducing this concept of zero-labor optimum. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is the natural consequence of the automation imperative that we talked about earlier. And it's quite simply the optimal number of employees for any business under ideal circumstances is 0 employees. Because employees, they can't work around the clock, they're expensive, they might sue you, they get sick, they quit, they have limited intelligence and limited physical abilities. So in the long run, when technology, not if, when technology is capable of replacing humans, you will. And eventually, the optimal business is one that has no human employees producing value. Instead, it's going to be all machines one day. Now, I'm not the first person to say this. Karl Marx predicted it more than a century ago.
Yeah.
He called it something else, but and he was a little bit early in his predictions because technology did create a few new avenues. He couldn't have predicted cloud data centers, I don't think. So that created a few new jobs. But ultimately, I think that in the long run, that is where we will get to, where a firm, that's the kind of the legal definition, a firm will be producing goods and services with no human labor input.
Yeah.
And that means, where do people work?
This is this is incredible to actually think about, that we could see a scenario where an ongoing enterprise exists with shares owned by shareholders, where complete business operations are automated and just are happening on their own. Now, we do have some examples of major organizations who are operating at massive scale with minimum humans. Can you maybe give us some real examples of these superstar organizations?
Yeah, so I already mentioned a couple. One of the ways that you can look at it is companies that become with billion-dollar valuations with only a few dozen employees. Instagram is one of the major ones.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a few others, but you can also look at RPE, or revenue per employee.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is that the companies with the highest RPE are high-tech companies like Nvidia and Apple. So those are kind of two sides of the same coin, where the thing that they have in common is they're all big tech. They're all tech companies or tech centric, whether it's Apple, which still employs quite a few people, but Apple's RPE, I think, is over 2.5 million.
Yep.
Nvidia, likewise, very high. I think it's somewhere between 1 and 4 million RPE.
Yeah. It's,
So
if I have my numbers right, it's over 3 million.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very, very, very high. So every person in those companies is generating quite a bit of revenue. Now, what happens as time goes on and artificial intelligence gets smarter and smarter and smarter, and that RPE goes up, right? And that's what we're actually seeing with
Yep.
some of the smaller companies, is that the revenue per employee is actually quite high. And in this paradigm, in the big tech, what's called the Magnificent Seven right now, which is the seven biggest tech companies, is headcount is not growing in connection, or the headcount growth is decoupling from revenue growth.
Yep.
That's another piece of evidence that this service sector is continuing to get more and more efficient, in the same way that manufacturing several decades ago started becoming more and more efficient. So in the same way that farming trended towards only 2% doing it, then what if manufacturing has only 2% of the population doing it,
Yep.
and then the service sector has only 2% of the population doing it?
Brilliant.
My
Brilliant.
math isn't great, but I
Yeah.
think that's only
No,
6%.
yeah, that's not 100%. You're right. You're right. No, so here's an interesting perspective. We are all hearing about unicorn companies, startup companies in tech that are, small number of people, billion-dollar valuations. We have those right now. There is projection that there will be soon a single-person billion-dollar enterprise as a new startup that grows to that evaluation by a single person surrounded by automation. But there is likely a scenario where existing companies would shrink down to 0 employees, or just essentially ownership of the company that is existing company that gets shrunk down to that number. So this is it may be very weird actually what we get to observe over the next few years as this unfolds. So now this leads us to the final part of chapter 2, final part which talks about the future of labor. So now this is where we're going to answer some of those questions of where do the labor refugees go? What will remain? So let's maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so whenever I look at it, I look at it through a few different angles, and you say, okay, well, what's going to persist? So one of the categories of the future of labor is those situations where a human, based on the money that they have, they will prefer to have another human there, and so that's what you might call the human premium, where basically laws of supply and demand. You say, you know what? I want to go to a concert. I don't want to see robots or a recording. I want to see real life human. Or if you go to your local coffee shop, or your local baker, right? You want to talk. You want to have real human connections. And those are just a few everyday examples. There's plenty of other examples where someone would prefer to have a real human, like a comedian, right? If
Yeah.
you had a robot as a comedian, some people might find that interesting, but you want to have that parasocial relationship with another human. That's one example. high liability and high trust jobs, those are examples like judges, lawyers, politicians, where someone is on the hook, someone is legally on the hook to do something.
Yep.
Even if they use a lot of automation, you say you are the one who's using that automation, and so we're going to make sure that you're responsible. Because, for instance, plenty of lawyers already use lots of AI. I have lawyer friends that have no paralegals because they just use AI now.
Yep.
So that's already happened. But there is a human behind that LLP to say, yes, I'm signing, I am providing you the advice, I have signed off on it, and it's my license to practice law that's on the line. So that's an example of a liability or a trust-based job. Beyond that, you can say, okay, well, what about those previous four paradigms: strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy? In some cases, for instance, certain kinds of therapy or retreats, that could be a really good use case for humans because, let's say you're going to a meditation retreat, you don't necessarily want a robot teaching you meditation. It would be very patient, but it's not going to have that same subjective experience that a human is going to have. So that's another example of where that last paradigm or that last offering that we have of empathy and just physical human presence could really be a differentiating factor. And one of the last categories that I have been looking at is just the thermodynamics of human bodies. We can operate most of the day on just a few pounds of food, which is
Mhm.
something that robots are not remotely close to yet.
Yep.
And we don't require a lot of infrastructure either. You can drop firefighters onto a mountain from a helicopter and they can go, fight a fire, mostly autonomously. Robots cannot do that yet. Of course, that might not be a moat forever, but that kind of independent functioning, underwater welding, soldiers, firefighters, some types of emergency responders. Now, the caveat there is that many of these groups are already incorporating robots to help them, not necessarily replace them. So those are just a few examples of, okay, yeah, there's probably going to be some human jobs that stick around forever. Fashionistas, for instance, that's probably an example of something that's going to stick around forever. Celebrities,
Yep.
but as we have more and more labor refugees, not everyone's going to be a movie star or a
That's
comedian or
yeah.
a firefighter. So I personally don't see all four of those categories absorbing enough of those labor refugees to really make a difference. We're going to have to cope with a relatively high amount of permanent unemployment in the future.
Yeah. Yes. And so the net of that is that there still will be work for humans, is the projection. We are not going to lose ability to work completely. There will still be work for humans, but it is unlikely that work will be enough to spread around for everyone, right?
Correct.
So
Yep.
we need a different paradigm, and hence post-labor economics. David, thank you very much. This was fantastic. Are you available for a few more minutes to address some of the questions from the audience?
Yeah, let's go through the questions.
Yeah. So we touched on demographic trends, and we, I think, agree that we are now facing a worldwide demographic sort of steady decline in most developed economies. How does demographic trends in the world play into post-labor economic model? Have you thought through that a little bit?
Yeah, so demographics actually really, I think is actually one of the driving factors. When you look at China, Japan, Italy, actually most of the world now is well below replacement rate. Not companies, countries are going to be in a lot of pain in the coming decades because their tax base will be shrinking, the worker base will be shrinking, and good grief, sorry, countries such as Japan have already explicitly said, let's start figuring out how to replace workers with robots, and they've been doing that for many years now. Uh, there's a cultural reason for that, and that is that the Japanese would prefer to work with robots than foreigners, by and large. Now, not every nation has that as a restraining factor, but eventually, with how low birth rates are, demographics will absolutely be a very compelling reason to move towards greater automation.
Yeah.
And as we increase the automation, you might say, ah, well, Dave, if that's the way that it's going, then that demographic decline means that if you are able to work, if you're an able-bodied worker, you've got it made. Sure, you might have another decade or two, but that's it. And you might not even have that long,
Yeah.
depending on how fast that automation ramps up. And the reason is because the whole point of automated labor or automating away labor is that it amortizes to a lower dollar per hour or dollar per output. So robots, once they get better, and again, the price is coming down by leaps and bounds, once robots get good enough, they will cost the equivalent, the total cost of ownership will be $1 to $3 per hour, maybe less. And
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
that's they're already approaching that
Yeah.
level
Yeah.
with the $5,000 to $8,000 humanoid robots.
Yeah. It is actually that to me is the long term. I'm not going to call it risk, reality that the once humanoid robots, but actually not just humanoid robots, we are facing. I'm sure you've heard the term of the Cambrian explosion of robotics,
Yep.
where robots are going to be from nano size that are flowing through your bloodstream and killing your cancer cells to the size of mega factories that are themselves automated robots producing more robots. But if we zoom into the humanoid robot, which is, I think, most probably compelling invention that we have, and if you consider that autonomous AI capability existing within an autonomous humanoid robot, and that robot might cost a fraction of what a currently, for example, a car would cost, because vehicles have tens of thousands of parts and weigh thousands of pounds of metal and steel. Well, robots will have hundreds of parts and weighing 75 pounds. If we can manufacture a car now automatically and sell it at 20 grand to buy a small new car, imagine how much cheaper a humanoid robot might be at the point when it's fully automated in its manufacture, and it's weighing 20 times less and has 20 times less number of parts. I think like this would be a transformational. It'll be just a matter of everybody will want not just one. Everybody will be able to afford few. Let alone,
Right.
right? That's a very interesting. So thank you very much, Richard, for that question. I have two more questions. One from Adam, one from Sebastian. If you're okay with that, David, and then we can wrap it up.
Sure.
So Sebastian says we will be significantly wealthier overall. That's clear. Like on a at the highest of perspectives, yes, new wealth will be generated at massive scale. But that will also mean that we will need to figure out how to share this wealth more fairly. So do we tackle this with small fixes to the current system, like taxing automation or taxing corporations? Or do you feel we need a whole new economic model? Maybe one that is built around common properties, what Sebastian asks.
Yeah, so I'm on the incrementalist side where yes, we need incremental fixes, not necessarily small, but certainly some people advocate for Pareto improvements. I'm a little bit more aggressive than that. We do need structural changes. So it's kind of the one of the ways of thinking is okay, what is just turning a knob that we've already got, right? Like what is the marginal tax rate of a corporation, or what is the tariff rate on this, or do we add a value added tax, or where do you fine tune those knobs versus creating entirely new knobs and levers? And I think it's both. I think it's both. The one thing that I advocate against very strongly is radical, reimagining of the entire
Yeah,
economic framework. And the reason is because history is littered with people with big ideas about, fundamentally new ways to organize society, and invariably, despite best intentions and sometimes because of bad intentions, but whatever the case may be, whenever you try and dramatically reimagine society, lots of people die. You end
yeah,
up with famines. You end up with civil wars. You end up
yeah,
with even worse, gulags and all kinds of things. So yes, whatever we do, it needs to be incremental changes that are politically viable, that are socially viable, that aren't going to cost lives or set us back. And that is part of the messiness that I have been engaging with post-labor economics, because lots of people come up with new economic frameworks and ideas and radical paradigm shifts. None of them are implementable. And that was one of
Yeah.
the core requirements of all of my work on post-labor economics is, yes, if you had, if you had a magic wand and you could reimagine everything, there's lots of ideas that we could try.
Yeah.
But you have to look at where we're at today and the problem that we're facing, the impetus behind all this, and then where we would like to go. But then you have to take each step.
Yeah.
And so that is the approach behind post-labor economics. Now, people are free to disagree with me, of course, but that has been my approach, which is to take a very incrementalist and politically realistic approach rather than
Yeah.
some great new paradigm. Because the last thing we want to do is end up with another great leap forward or Leninism or that sort of thing. That's what
Yes.
we
Yeah.
want to avoid.
So, so net here is post-labor economics, and your view here is you're not an economic revolutionist. This is more better described as maybe economical rapid evolutionist.
Yep. The evolutionary pressure is going to happen, like it or not. I'm just trying to prepare as best as we
Correct.
can.
Correct. And what is also important, and I've had a pleasure of having the early read of your material, that this is I think this is important to say that we are not promoting here a new version of communism. Quite the opposite. We believe that capitalism and market economy is the right foundation, but what we need to figure out is capitalism 2.0, essentially. That
Yep.
close labor economics is a capitalism 2.0, where individuals have to have economic agency of some kind, of some form, to continue to participate productively, as
Yep.
opposed to individuals being simply fed through the government, which is the dystopia. We do not promote that. That is not what this is all about. So this is not communism 2.0, it is capitalism 2.0.
Correct. Yeah. I situate it like one of the kind of lenses that I look at it through is neoliberalism got us through the last few decades, but we need a replacement or an evolution of neoliberalism, a new set of rules and guidelines for the next, half century to a century. And I'm sure the paradigm will change again too, as we
Yep.
just before we hit record, we were talking about, well, what happens if we get warp drive or hyperdrive?
Yep.
Then your primary job is going to be space colonist, which will be
Yep.
great, but we got to get from here to there.
Yeah. That might be the fifth paradigm, right?
There we go.
Humans as space exploration species. And while I chuckle about that, as I say, fast forward 10 years, this might actually happen. We might be starting that industry, right? The actual space colonization. Let's take Adam's questions as a last question. So Adam's asking about universal basic income. And he says, how might we reposition universal basic income as something much bigger than lowest common denominator wage replacement? For example, UBI as personal seed capitals to spin up your own decoupling experiments. What are some other ways to make transfers more aspirational and give people more skin in the game? Which is essentially, that's the question. Like, how do we reposition UBI to be viewed as something that creates opportunities as opposed to something that muffles humans' contribution?
Right. Yeah. So first and foremost, the idea is to correctly situate what is UBI. And what it is, it's a type of transfer, meaning that it is money that is either printed from the government or taxed and redistributed by the government. Your local government and your state government can't print money, so they have to tax and redistribute. The federal government could just print money, but that's very inflationary. So UBI must be lowest common denominator by virtue of the fact that it is a type of transfer. What I have come to believe in, and what many other economists also already believe in, is that we need to broaden property-based income. And
Mm.
so one way to think of it is UBI is just the floor. Now there's other ideas, universal basic capital, sovereign wealth funds, other kinds of sources that are property-based. So a sovereign wealth fund, it could be based on natural resources. It could also just be based on investments. Not that you necessarily want to think of the United States as a hedge fund, but you get the idea where it could
Yeah.
own assets and the dividends from those assets are then redistributed to the people. So
Yeah.
then in that case, it's managed for you. Universal basic capital, these are like baby bonds. These are ideas that are already being piloted in various states. And it's even, the federal government is launching a trial of a baby bond type thing. So that means that everyone's going to have a slice of the pie guaranteed, minimum slice of the pie guaranteed by the federal government or your state government, which is another good way to say, hey, you're now thinking instead of your labor being exchanged for wages, your labor is to make better investments. So there'll still be plenty to do. And not only that, you can contribute directly to some of those investments, or you can do private investments. So
Yeah.
to take a big step back, if I had to just put post-labor economics in one sentence, it is transitioning from wage labor social contract to broad property-based income.
Property-based.
From
Yeah.
here
Fantastic.
to there, that's it. That's in a nutshell what we're trying to do. Now, UBI is one necessary but not sufficient piece of that puzzle. We need other levers, and there's plenty of examples all over the world from more legalizing blockchain-based technologies such as decentralized autonomous organizations, baby bonds, and so on, sovereign wealth funds, urban wealth funds, carbon taxes. I mean, there's hundreds of examples out there that'll all be in the book as well,
Yeah.
as to policies that can say what do we hold in common, and how can we monetize that fairly and broadly.
Yeah. This was excellent, David. As you were answering this last question, I actually took a look at the questions that we received from audience before the show,
Okay,
and like we have addressed most, but there is one that, if you don't mind, I want to ask you that we haven't actually touched. But I heard
sure.
many people say, in this transition, as labor is displaced, there is an opportunity to shorten the work week so that people can, like that is proposed as one alternative, that we could potentially establish a new or a transitionary social contract where workers work 4 days a week, then 3 days a week, then 2 days a week, and we flip the weekend. So the weekend is 5 days and jobs, and we work for 2. What are your thoughts on that?
So that could have happened by now, and it was predicted to have happened, but it hasn't. And if anything, particularly in developed nations, it's the opposite trend. People work more. So there's a few reasons for this. Number one is the overhead of having employees. For a company, paying an employee is not just their salary. I just saw a statistic in France where I think it's something like 60% of what a company pays doesn't go to the employee. It's taxes, it's insurance, it's other components, other overhead. So companies are incentivized to have as few headcount as possible. And this is there's many reasons to that. There's management overhead. The more people you have, the more managers you need. So just trying to distribute shrinking pool of labor demand over more people, that actually artificially creates inefficiency. So there's lots of reasons not to do that. But then furthermore, okay, let's say that your work week is taken down to 2 days a week, and your salary also goes down. So what are you going to do? You're going to look for another job. So people that have a job would prefer to just work full time, I think, because it's like, hey, instead of managing, 2 or 3 or 4 jobs, I manage one job.
Yeah.
And then that's the most efficient relationship from the employer's perspective as well.
Yeah.
So I don't see that as being, it's an idea, and most recently Bill Gates has floated the idea repeatedly. I don't think that
Practical.
the numbers just don't add up to me.
Yeah, it's not practical. It's a good concept, but might not be practical. David, this was fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. And for the audience members, our next episode, part 3, which is going to talk about power and social contracts, is going to happen on September 5th, so 2 Fridays from now. Same time, same channel, and of course this is going to be soon available on Tectonic Conversations YouTube channel, and David, I'm sure you'll post it on yours as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dalibor. Talk later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.